Well, organ nuts, I'd just like you to hear a snippet of conversation I had a couple of weeks ago with a very famous organist.
Wouldn't take long, and after all, we don't often have you over here. I mean, couldn't you just give us a little tune for the programme?
Yeah, I know, old boy, but look, I'm over here on a lightning visit, and there's all kinds of friends that I want to look up, and they'll be hurting their feelings if I don't see them.
But the nuts will shoot me if they'd known you'd been here and you hadn't recorded for the programme. Look, I'll see, because we've got a super organ down at Granada Kingston, and if I can fix up the engineers, come on, do play for us once, won't you?
Well, for you, yes, all right, I will.
Oh, well, that's fine, that's fine.
And as if you didn't recognise that friendly, familiar voice, I was talking, of course, to Reginald Foort, doyen of theatre organists, who was over here recently on a flying visit. And as you hear, we did manage to get him on an organ bench.
Hello, everybody. This is Reginald Foort, not, I'm sorry to say it, the good old BBC theatre organ, but on a very interesting organ from my point of view here at the Granada Theatre, Kingston on Thames. Actually, this is the very, very first organ that I ever had to play when I first became a theatre organist. Only in those days it was in the New Picture House, Edinburgh, and I had to go up and play the opening show. So you can imagine that as you play an opening show in Edinburgh, you have to play Scottish music. So here it is. Well, now, years and years later after this, I had the great thrill and pleasure of meeting Harry Lauder in Glasgow. And it was rather unfortunate. He'd broken his leg some time before, and when I met him, it had just healed up enough, and he wanted to show me that he could still dance. So he turned round to me, and he said, "Reggie, play me a bit of the Road to the Isles." So I started off on the piano to play the Road to the Isles, and before I'd played 4 bars, Harry Lauder stopped me and said, "No, no, my lad, you don't know how to play the Road to the Isles." And he proceeded to give me a lesson on how to play the Road to the Isles.
Well, then I asked Reg Foort if he remembered the historic opening night of the original BBC theatre organ on October the 20th, 1936.
Oh, the BBC organ, what an occasion that was. We had a whole hour's programme on the opening night, and they had Quentin MacLean, who came in, started and played very loud and went well over his time. And then Reggie New came along and played very loud and played well over his time. And Harold Ramsey came along and played very loud and played over his time. And while they were playing, a messenger came round to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, but you'll have to cut your piece down because we're well late." And so I had been going to start off with a great big noisy loud overture, and having to cut it out just by absolute accident made all the difference in the world, because I started with a nice quiet piece, Musetta's Song.
Actually, it wasn't Reggie New, it was Reginald Porter Brown. Oh, that was absolutely beautiful, Reg. You know, I've known you for a long time.
40 years.
Reginald, 40 years, eh?
Yeah. And we've had great times together, I must say, but I'm enjoying this more than anything for many a long time. It's such fun to be broadcasting again.
Tell us a bit about your days touring with the Moller.
Oh, those were marvellous. We used to go round, you know, with 5 30-foot road trucks and a wonderful staff of 15. And we used to start on a Monday night. We opened at the Palace Theatre, Manchester. And in Vaudeville, you always do 6 nights, twice nightly, and you're closed on Sunday. So we used to do the 12 shows in 6 nights. And then at 11 o'clock on the Saturday night, the boys would descend on the organ and pull it all apart. And it was so beautifully designed, they could have it out in the trucks and on the way to the next theatre in about 4.5 hours. So it worked very well. Of course, it was a wonderful time. Unfortunately, after only 9 months, the war came along and rather spoilt things altogether.
But nothing can spoil our enjoyment of Reg Foort's music. And here he is playing You're the Cream in My Coffee, Tea for Two, and Lullaby of Broadway, not on his travelling organ, but on the Granada Kingston on Thames Wurlitzer. Reg, tell us something about that historic 78 recording of yours you made in the old days of In a Monastery Garden and Persian Market.
Oh, that one. Well, that's rather a sad story, really, because it was the very first organ recording I'd ever made. It was the first time HMV had ever recorded a Wurlitzer organ, and they gave me a contract for the fantastic sum of £50 to play this, and they gave us 3 hours. Fancy in those days earning £50 in under 3 hours. So I chose these two numbers and played them. And of course, in those days, you didn't have any of the luxury of this beautiful tape recording where you could stop and go again and stop and go again. You had hot wax. They used to bring thick wax records out which were kept hot, and you had to do absolutely immaculate playing for the 2.5 minutes for the 10-inch or the 3.25 minutes for the, I forget the exact times, but that was about it. So I played the two numbers, and they sent them back to the factory and had them made up into what they call test pressings, and then they sent for me and I heard them. I have never been so disgusted. It was the most awful, horrible sound, and I begged them to let me do them all over again for nothing. Well, they wouldn't do it. They quietly put them out. Of course, I didn't get any idea of how many they'd sold because I was on a flat rate and not a royalty. So about 14 years later, a friend of mine got a job at Hayes with HMV, and I got hold of him and said, listen, do be a good fellow and look into the books and find out how many of that record they really did sell. And I was staggered to find that the total was 3.25 million copies.
Well, as I say, if we'd have had golden discs in those days, you'd have certainly got one.
Yes, and I should have had a nice fat royalty of about £20,000 out of it.
Yes.
Two snippets from Reginald Foort's famous record, which he played again the other day at the Granada Kingston. Reg, how did you first become an organist?
Oh, my father was a son of a farmer, and he made up his mind years before that he wanted to be an organist. But of course, in those days, living out in the middle of the country, in Worcestershire actually, he had very little chance of getting any musical education. And what he did by correspondence. But he did ultimately succeed in breaking away from the farm and getting a small job as an organist, but he couldn't make it go. So he had to get out of it and earn his living in other ways. But you can imagine that when he was going to have a son, that son was going to be an organist. And I was that son. So before I was born, I am sure I was fated to be an organist. In fact, when I was 11, my parents moved to Rugby, so that I could get some tip-top organ training, and I had the most marvellous training with Dr. Basil Johnson, the musical director of Rugby School, the greatest teacher who ever was. In 4 years, he taught me more than I've ever learned since.
Reginald Foort playing Fritz Kreisler's Liebesfreude on the Granada Kingston Wurlitzer.
Reg, you know, it was wonderful to have you here last year in April of 1971, that historic concert at the Royal Albert Hall with Marcel Dupré.
That was marvellous. He was a marvellous old boy, that. He was so nice to me, too. He really was. He was a real joy to know.
Well, it's nice to hear you say that, because you've been so nice to so many people. You've helped thousands of people, literally, in the musical world, and organists. And I must say, Reg, it's a great thrill to me to talk to such an old and dear friend who is the doyenne of the theatre organists. And before we go, we must have you saying this in this lovely voice of yours, which is as famous as your playing. You know, your famous catchphrase. I won't take the... You know,
it's amusing that. I don't know how it grew up, but I got into a habit of finishing up every broadcast by saying, well, now I'll be playing to you next time so-and-so, and in the meantime, don't forget to keep smiling.
And keep smiling we will, as long as you're around, Reginald Foort. That's about the lot from me, your old organ grinder, Robin Richmond. So, till our next prayer meeting, same time next week, it's bye-bye from me now as we listen to Reg Foort's famous signature tune.